The weirwood had never bled like this before. Ned Stark had come to the Godswood at dawn, as he did every morning, alone, as a man of the North was meant to pray, kneeling before the heart tree with its carved face frozen in that ancient, knowing expression his father had taught him to respect rather than understand. The Godswood at Winterfell was the oldest place he knew, older than the castle, older than the Starks themselves, perhaps. The red leaves barely stirred in winter's pre-dawn stillness. The pool at the heart tree's roots was black as a raven's wing and perfectly still, and in its surface Ned could see the pale ghost of his own face looking back at him, a young man of 19 carrying the weight of a dead father, a dead brother, and a rebellion that had no clean ending. He had been thinking of Lyanna. He always thought of Lyanna. The weirwood's carved face began to weep, not the slow red sap weeping Ned had witnessed 100 times before, that contemplative, ancient grief the old gods expressed in silence. This was different. The sap ran fast and dark down the white bark, pooling in the carved eye sockets, running in rivulets across the carved mouth that had never, in all of Ned's years of prayer, looked anything other than calm. Now it looked agonized. The red leaves rattled without wind. The pool at the roots went from black to a deep, arterial red, and the surface broke in, concentric rings expanding outward as though something had struck it from below. Then the tree split. Not broke, not cracked, split, down the center of that ancient carved face. White bark peeling outward in two great curling sheets. And from the gap between them came light that had no business existing in any Godswood Ned Stark had ever heard of. Not the pale light of dawn, not torchfire. Something orange and violent and furious, like looking through a keyhole into a furnace the size of the world. The heat struck Ned's face like an open hand. He stumbled backward, sword half drawn before the thought had fully formed. And then the light died, and in the split heart of the weirwood stood something that was not a man. It was shaped like one, broad-shouldered, tall, taller than any man Ned knew, though Robert Baratheon would have come close. It was armored in a fashion no Westerosi maester or blacksmith could have named. Deep green plate that had clearly once been finer still, scarred and scored and stained in colors that Ned did not want to identify in the dim pre-dawn light. The helmet was a full visor, blank-faced, revealing nothing of the creature wearing it. In the split second before his soldier's instincts took full hold, Ned noticed three things. The armor was still smoking, thin curls of dark vapor rising from the pauldrons and gauntlets. Whatever clung to the boots and greaves, dark, thick, viscous, was not blood from any animal Ned had ever hunted. And the hands, even gauntlet, were clenched into fists with a tension that suggested a body, holding itself very still by an act of supreme, disciplined will. The figure stood motionless in the weirwood's split bark. The red leaves had gone completely still. The carved face of the heart tree, split in two, still wept its dark sap down both pale halves. And the pool at the roots, now fully red, reflected the armored shape standing in the gap like a painting of something that had no name in any tongue Ned Stark spoke. Ned's sword came fully out. "Identify yourself," he said. His voice was steady. He had been raised by a lord who believed that a man's voice in crisis revealed his breeding and whatever Ned was feeling. And he was feeling quite a lot. It was not going to reach his voice this morning. The figure turned its visor toward him. It did not speak. It looked at Ned Stark with that blank, expressionless faceplate for a long moment, the kind of assessment Ned recognized from men who had seen a great deal of violence and were deciding whether the thing in front of them constituted a threat worth their attention. Then it looked down at its own hands, opened them, closed them, looked at the godswood around it, the white trees, the red leaves, the pool, the pale sky beginning to lighten above the castle walls. It turned a slow, full circle, taking in every detail with the methodical attention of something, cataloging an unfamiliar battlefield. Then it looked back at Ned, and Ned Stark, who had faced the Mad King's power, who had watched his father and brother die at Aerys' command, who had ridden to war at 19 and meant to ride again. Ned Stark felt, quite distinctly, that the thing standing in his godswood was deciding whether he was a threat, and that its conclusion on that question would come a great deal faster than his own. He kept his sword up. "You came through the heart tree," he said, because stating the impossible plainly was the only way he knew to begin. understanding it. The old gods brought you here. The figure, the warrior, Ned's soldier's mind was already categorizing it. Because whatever else it was, everything about its stance and bearing and the scarred armor spoke of a creature that had fought more battles than Ned could count, gave no response. It glanced down at where its weapons should have been. The motion was economical, unsurprised. The gesture of a man who had lost his sword before and was already adapting. It looked at Ned's blade with what might have been professional assessment. Then it stepped out of the split weirwood, and the bark closed behind it like a wound sealing shut. And the heart tree was whole again, weeping its slow sap. Its carved face returned to its ancient, patient expression. Whatever had come through was here now. And the old gods, having delivered it, offered no further explanation. By the time the castle's watch had been roused, by the time Maester Whaleys had been fetched from his tower, sleep rumpled and alarmed, and Ned's household guard had formed a nervous half-circle at the godswood's entrance with torches that did very little against the pre-dawn cold. The armored figure had not moved from the spot where it had stepped out of the tree. It stood in the center of the godswood's clearing with its arms at its sides and watched the growing cluster of Winterfell's servants and guards with an expression no one could read because no one could see its face. Sir Roderick Castle, who was 38 and had served House Stark since before Ned was born and had seen enough strange things in the North to possess a healthy skepticism about what constituted impossible, stood at Ned's shoulder and said, very quietly, "It's not moving toward us." "No," Ned agreed. "And it came through the heart tree." "Yes." Roderick was quiet for a moment. "The old gods have sent stranger things, I suppose. Though I couldn't name one." Maester Whaleys had brought a torch close enough to examine the armor, though he kept what Ned privately thought was a prudent 6 feet of distance between himself and the figure. The maester's chain caught the torchlight, steel and copper and the pale silver of his highest link, and his scholar's eyes moved across the armored surface with the hungry attention of a man cataloging something he would never be able to adequately explain. In a letter to the Citadel, "The metallurgy is unlike anything in the known world," he said, which was not particularly useful information, but was at least accurate. "The alloy composition, I can't identify it. And these markings," he gestured toward the suit's surface, where symbols and script were embossed in a language that resembled no runic tradition Whaleys had encountered. "This is not Valyrian. It is not the old tongue. It is not anything I have." The figure's head turned toward Whaleys. The maester went quiet very quickly. "It understands us," Ned said. Not a question, a recognition. Something in the way those blank eyes, if there were eyes behind that visor. Ned found he assumed there were, which was perhaps telling, tracked their conversation. "It's listening." Roderick grunted. "Listening and not speaking. That's either wisdom or it can't." What happened in the next few minutes would become, in Winterfell's servant quarters and guards' barracks, one of those stories people told in careful whispers for decades, embellished over time, disputed in its details, but consistent in its essential shape. The armored figure turned from Maester Whaleys' torch and walked, unhurried and deliberate, to the nearest of Ned's household guards, a man named Harwick, broad-shouldered, reliable, who was holding a Westerosi longsword in both hands with the white-knuckled grip of someone, maintaining composure through sheer effort. The figure stopped in front of him. Harwick did not, to his eternal credit, step back. The figure looked at the sword. Then it looked at Harwick. Then it held out one gauntlet hand, palm up. Ned said, "Give it the sword, Harwick." Harwick handed it over with the expression of a man who was reasonably certain this was either the best or worst decision he would make this year. The figure took the long sword in one hand, turned it once, tested its balance with a single fluid motion that made Roderick Castle's eyes sharpen with professional recognition, and then held it in a proper fighting grip. Not the grip of someone learning a new tool, but the grip of someone confirming that a familiar type of tool was functional in a new form. It looked at Ned. Ned looked back. "You know how to use it," Ned said. The figure said nothing, but there was something in the set of those armored shoulders, a settling, a calibration, the almost imperceptible shift of a warrior who has taken stock of new conditions and found them workable. That told Ned Stark everything he needed. to know about what the old gods had put in his godswood. Whatever this was, it was not dangerous to him. Not yet. Perhaps not at all, if he handled this correctly. And there was a war to win. His father and brother were dead. Lyanna was somewhere in the south, held by Rhaegar Targaryen. Robert Baratheon was raising the Seven Kingdoms in rebellion, and the North needed to answer that call with every sword it could find. The old gods had never given Ned Stark anything without reason. He looked at the armored figure, standing in his godswood with a Westerosi longsword held at its side, like it weighed nothing, surrounded by his nervous household, backlit by the pre-dawn gray above Winterfell's ancient walls. "I don't know what you are," Ned said, quietly enough that only Roderick heard it. "But I know what you're not. You're not my enemy." He raised his voice. "Stand down. All of you." His household guard lowered their weapons with varying degrees of reluctance. Ned sheathed his own sword. "Maester Whaleys, we'll need the Great Hall. And send a raven to Lord Robert. Tell him," he paused, considering what in seven hells he was supposed to tell Robert Baratheon. "Tell him the old gods have taken an interest in this rebellion. He can decide what to make of that." He turned back to the figure. "You'll need a name," Ned said. "Something the men can say." The figure didn't offer one. Ned thought of the godswood, the heart tree's split face, the light that had come through from somewhere that was not Westeros. He thought of the old gods' silence, their ancient, purposeful, terrifying silence, and what it meant that they had broken it. Even once, even like this. "The men will call you what they see," he said finally. "And what they see is a warrior the gods pulled from somewhere else entirely." He glanced at Roderick. "For now, he stays in the castle. He eats with the guard if he eats. He's given what he needs." He met the blank visor one more time. "And no one touches that armor." If you want to see more characters enter different universes, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and the universe you'd want to see them in down in the comments below. All men must die, but legends endure. The raven to Robert Baratheon went out before the sun had fully risen over Winterfell's walls. What Ned wrote, precisely, no one but he and Maester Whaleys ever knew. But the raven that came back 3 days later, in Robert's broad, impatient hand, contained only 7 words. "Ned, what in the 7 hells?" The raven from Robert Baratheon arrived on a Tuesday, which was the same day that Ned Stark watched the armored figure dismantle 6 of his best household guard in the training yard without drawing the longsword Harwick had given him. It had not been a fight. That was the word Roderick Castle used afterward. Sitting in Ned's solar with a cup of wine he had poured himself without asking, and was drinking with the focused attention of a man processing something his professional experience had not prepared him for. "It wasn't a fight, my lord. A fight implies 2 sides with a reasonable chance at the outcome. What I watched this morning was something else entirely. What Roderick had watched, what half of Winterfell's garrison had watched from the yard's perimeter with expressions ranging from awe to barely concealed terror, was the armored figure responding to a training session that had escalated in the way training sessions sometimes do when pride and curiosity combine badly. From observation to participation to something that no one had quite intended. It had started with Jory Castle, Roderick's nephew, 17, good with a blade and possessed of the particular confidence of a young man who has not yet been genuinely humbled by the world. Jory had watched the armored figure stand motionless at the training yard's edge for the better part of an hour, observing the household guard's morning drills with that blank, assessing patience that unnerved everyone who encountered it. And Jory, being 17 and good with a blade, had done what 17-year-olds with swords eventually do in the presence of something they don't understand. He had offered it a spar. The figure had looked at him for a long moment, that same cataloging assessment Ned had first seen in the godswood, and then stepped into the yard. What followed took approximately 4 minutes. In that time, the figure, moving with a speed that was simply not possible for something wearing that much armor, a speed that made Ser Roderick's experienced eye narrow and recalculate everything it thought it understood about human physical limits, had redirected Jory's first 3 attacks with open-handed deflections that hit like striking a castle wall, disarmed him on the 4th exchange with a wrist rotation so efficient it looked almost gentle, and set him on the ground with a controlled fall that left the boy winded but uninjured. When Jory got up, as young men do, and reached for the sword, the figure simply held it out to him, hilt first, and waited. Then Harwick had come in. Then two more of Ned's guard. Then all six of them together. The figure moved through them like water moving through reeds, not aggressive, not cruel, absorbing every attack and redirecting every blade with the calm, precise economy of something that had been doing this so long that violence had become a language. It spoke without accent. It hit hard when it needed to. Harwick would be nursing his ribs for a week, but it never struck with full force, and no one who went into that yard came out with anything worse than wounded pride and bruised muscle. Roderick had watched the whole thing from the wall. When it was over, when the six men were sitting or standing in various states of winded dishevelment, and the armored figure had returned to the yard's edge and resumed its motionless observation, Roderick had gone directly to Ned's solar and poured his wine. "It was holding back," was the first thing he said. Ned looked up from Robert's raven. "How much?" "Substantially." Roderick drank. Jory went at it full speed. Harwick and the others went in serious. "My lord, I have trained men for 30 years. I know what a man at his limit looks like." He paused. That wasn't at its limit. Not remotely. Ned set down Robert's letter. Outside the solar's window, the training yard had returned to its normal rhythms. But he could see the gap the men were keeping around the figure, still standing at the yard's edge, watching, like a ring of empty space that no one wanted to acknowledge. They were maintaining. "The old gods don't do things without purpose," he said. "No, they don't." Roderick set down his cup, which raises the question of what purpose requires something like that. It was the question Ned had been sitting with since the gods would, turning it over the way he turned difficult problems, quietly, thoroughly, from every angle. Robert's rebellion needed every advantage the North could bring to it. Aerys Targaryen sat the Iron Throne with a spymaster's eyes on every lord in the realm and wildfire caches beneath King's Landing that represented the most catastrophic threat any city in Westerosi history had ever faced. The Trident hadn't been fought. King's Landing hadn't fallen. Rhaegar was alive and somewhere in the south with Lyanna. And the old gods, who had maintained their silence for thousands of years, who communicated in rustling leaves and red dreams and the slow weeping of carved bark, had reached through their network of weirwood eyes and pulled something from somewhere else entirely and deposited it in his godswood. They had not explained why, but the figure's behavior since arrival had been consistent. It observed, it cataloged, it tested the tools available to it, and it watched the horizon with the attention of something that was waiting. Not restless, not impatient, simply waiting, as though it knew a threat was coming and was allowing itself time to understand the terrain before it arrived. Ned recognized that patience. He had seen it in his father. He saw it in himself, sometimes, when he looked in the glass. He picked up his quill and began composing his reply to Robert. 3 days later, a second raven came. Not from Robert, from King's Landing. Ned broke the seal, read the contents, and went very still in his chair for a long moment. Maester Whaleys, who had been hovering nearby, with the expression of a scholar who has stumbled onto a discovery that will consume the rest of his scholarly life, noticed the stillness. "My lord, Aerys knows," Ned said. "Not knows what, precisely." The raven was from a source within the Red Keep whose name Ned kept in the most private part of his memory and would never commit to paper, one of the network of careful correspondences that the North's lords had maintained through decades of political caution. The message was brief and used the agreed-upon code language, but its meaning was plain. Word had reached King's Landing of an armored warrior in the north unlike anything in Westerosi. Knowledge. A warrior who had come, by some accounts that were already circulating in the wildfire-addled whisper networks of the capital, through a weirwood tree. A warrior the Starks were keeping. Aerys had reportedly found this information very interesting. The Mad King's interest was, categorically, not a thing one wanted. Ned folded the raven's message and held it in the candle flame until it caught, then set the burning paper in the hearth and watched it go to ash. He stood and walked to the window. In the training yard below, the armored figure was doing something he hadn't seen it do before. It was working through what appeared to be a series of combat forms, alone, methodical. the long sword moving through patterns that bore no resemblance to any Westerosi fighting style Ned could identify. The movements were precise and terrifyingly fast, and they spoke of a fighting methodology developed for opponents that Westerosi swordsmanship had never been designed to face. "Maester Whaleys," Ned said, without turning from the window. "My lord, you've been studying the armor, the symbols, every hour I can spare. I've cross-referenced every text in our library. Have you found anything?" A pause that carried the specific weight of scholarly reluctance. "Nothing definitive, but there are oblique references. Old texts from the Children of the Forest, transcribed by the first maesters who came north. References to dimensions, adjacent to our own, to a war older than Westeros, older than the first men. A war between something the children called." Whaleys hesitated, as academics do when they're about to say something that sounds insane. "The living flame and the devouring dark." Ned turned from the window. "The texts are fragmentary," Whaleys said quickly. "Highly interpretive. I wouldn't normally cite them as. What do they say about this war?" Another pause. "That it never ends. That it has been fought across more worlds than the children could count. And that," the maester's voice dropped slightly, "that the old gods have intervened in it before, pulled warriors from one side of it to places where the devouring dark was gaining purchase, used them as." The text uses the word instruments, which I find theologically troubling, but "the devouring dark," Ned said. He looked out the window again at the figure, moving through its forms, in the gray Winterfell morning. "Is that what's stirring beyond the wall?" Whaleys was quiet for a long time. "I don't know," he finally said. "But I think whatever the old gods pulled into your gods what has been fighting that war for a very long time. And I think they pulled it here because they believe the war has followed." Below in the yard, the armored figure paused in its forms. It turned its visor toward the northern horizon, not the south, where Robert's rebellion burned, not the east, where ravens flew to kings, north, toward the wall and the darkness beyond it, with an attention so focused and so still that two of the guardsmen nearby took unconscious steps backward. Then it returned to its forms. Ned watched it for a long moment. Then he made two decisions. The first was that the North would march to join Robert's rebellion within the fortnight. And this warrior, whatever it was, whoever had made it, whatever the old gods intended by sending it, would march with them. The second was that he would ride to the wall himself before the year was out, because Maester Whaleys's fragmentary texts and the figures northward attention were telling him something that Winterfell's comfortable walls and Robert's urgent ravens were conspiring to make it easy to ignore. Winter was not merely coming. Something was already moving in it. The rebellion needed winning first. Ares needed removing. Lyanna needed finding. These were the immediate, pressing, human emergencies that demanded a lord's attention and a brother's love and a bannerman's sword. But the figure in his training yard had not looked south toward King's Landing when it scanned the horizon. It had looked north. And the old gods did not pull weapons from other dimensions for problems that could wait. Ned went to find Roderick Castle. They had a march to plan, a war council to assemble, and a letter to write to Robert Baratheon that would require every diplomatic gift Ned possessed to explain why the North's army would be arriving with something that no maester in the Citadel could classify and no Westerosi tradition could account for. He found himself, almost against his will, looking forward to watching the gold cloaks faces when they rode into King's Landing. The Northern army moved south in the third week of the moon's turn, and the Doomslayer walked among them like a word no one knew how to pronounce. Ned had given him a place in the column, not at the vanguard, not at the rear, but beside Ned himself, which communicated to every lord and bannerman who rode past that, whatever this armored figure was, the Lord of Winterfell had made a choice about it. That choice drew stares. It drew whispered conversations between knights who thought themselves far enough back in the column to be safe from northern ears. Lord Dustin of Barrowton rode past, twice on the first day under the transparent pretense of checking his flank before finally drawing alongside Ned and saying, with the carefully neutral expression of a man trying to be diplomatic about something that was defeating his diplomacy, "The men are asking questions, my lord." "Let them ask," Ned said. "And what should I tell them?" "Tell them the old god sent it. Tell them it fights on our side. Tell them. Ned glanced briefly at the armored figure walking with that tireless, ground-eating stride. That had already impressed his outriders by keeping pace with horses, without apparent effort. Tell them not to touch the armor. Lord Dustin absorbed this. And if they want to know what it is, so do I, Ned said honestly. When I find out, I'll let you know. This was not the most reassuring conversation Lord Dustin had ever had, but it was apparently sufficient, because he dropped back into the column without further objection. The North's lords were not, as a rule, men who pushed too hard against Stark decisions on Stark land, and whatever unease the armored figure generated, and it generated a great deal, a kind of low constant, atmospheric tension that the column carried around it like weather. There was something else present, in the men's reactions too, something Ned noticed, in the way they watched the figure move and the way their voices changed when they thought it might be listening. Fear, yes, but underneath the fear, something that wanted very much to become its opposite. The first real test came at the crossing of the neck. Moat Cailin stood as it always had, half-ruined, fully haunted. The ancient fortress that had stopped every southern army that ever tried to take the north by force. The crannogmen of the neck moved in the bogs around it like shadows, and Lord Howland Reed met Ned's column at the causeway with 30 men and the particular watchful stillness of someone raised in a land that killed the careless. Howland Reed was a small man with quick eyes who said very little and noticed everything. He greeted Ned with the measured warmth of genuine friendship. They had ridden together before the rebellion, had shared confidences that neither would ever commit to a raven, and then his eyes moved past Ned to the armored figure standing 4 feet back and slightly to the left, which was the position it had settled into as Ned's column traveled, in which Ned had begun to think of, with complicated feelings, as a bodyguard's placement. Howland looked at the figure for a long time. The figure looked back. The Weirwoods are talking, Howland said finally, still looking at the armored shape. His voice carried the tone of a man relaying information he has not fully processed. The crannogmen have been hearing it for 2 weeks. The faces are restless, more restless than I've seen in my lifetime. He turned to Ned. The old gods put that here. Yes. Why? I'm working on that. Howland was quiet for a moment. Then, unexpectedly, he walked directly to the armored figure, past the invisible radius of unease that everyone else in the column maintained, and stopped 3 feet in front of it and looked up at the visor with the calm, attentive expression of a man who speaks to gods in the whispers of leaves and has learned not to be frightened by what answers. The faces showed me something, he said to the figure, conversationally, as though discussing the weather. A darkness older than the wall, and something older than the darkness. Fighting it. He paused. That's you, isn't it? The figure didn't speak, but something shifted, some infinitesimal adjustment of posture, some slight orientation of that blank visor that an a human being would have constituted. Acknowledgement. Howland Reed nodded slowly. The crannogmen will let your column pass without levy, he said to Ned, still watching the figure. And I'll ride with you to the Trident. I think, another pause, the kind that preceded things Howland Reed was uncertain how to say. I think the old gods want eyes on this that understand what they're seeing. He fell into step beside the figure without waiting for Ned's response. The figure didn't object. They crossed the neck in 2 days and rode hard south through the riverlands. And with every mile the news from the south grew more urgent and more grim. Robert's forces had engaged the Targaryen loyalists at Stony September and taken the town. The Battle of the Bells now fixed in the rebellion's history as the moment the tide turned. Rhaegar Targaryen himself had emerged from wherever he'd been keeping Lyanna and was marshalling the royal host for what everyone on both sides understood would be the decisive confrontation. The ravens spoke of numbers, 20,000, swords for Robert, perhaps more, and the crown's forces matching them, and of terrain, the Tridents, crossing point where armies went to settle the questions that politics had failed to answer. They also spoke, in the careful language of men, trying to report something accurately, without sounding as though they'd lost their minds, of the Targaryen loyalist behavior in recent weeks. Strange things at the edge of patrols. Men found dead in ways that didn't match Westerosi weapons. Small units going out and not returning from the Kingswood's darker reaches. One scout's report, which had been passed up the chain with a note from his commanding officer expressing significant skepticism about the scout's reliability, described what sounded in its essentials like a reanimated dead man walking out of the tree in the early morning fog. Ned read that report 3 times. Then he handed it to Howland Reed without comment. Howland read it once. Then he looked at the armored figure, who was standing at the camp's edge staring northeast with that focused, patient attention it directed at horizons, and said, quietly, "We need to move faster." The Doomslayer had already turned from the horizon toward Ned, as though it had heard the thought before Ned had fully formed it. It looked at him across the firelit camp with that blank, unreadable faceplate, and Ned had the sudden, absolute conviction, the kind of conviction that came from somewhere below reason, from whatever instinct the old gods sharpened in men who listened to weirwoods, that the figure had been aware of what those scouts had encountered before the ravens had been written, that it had recognized, from the first moment it had looked north over Winterfell's walls, that this world had a version of what it had been fighting, and that it had been waiting, with a warrior's patient discipline, for the humans around it to catch up. The incident at the ford happened on the 4th day south of Moat Cailin, and it was the first time the northern column saw the armored figure do something that could not be attributed to extraordinary human ability. A Targaryen loyalist scouting party, 12 mounted knights, with the 3-headed dragon on their shields, came out of the eastern tree at a gallop, clearly intending to harry the columns, flank in the way fast cavalry, harried marching infantry, the hit-and-ride tactic that had won and lost 100 Westerosi engagements. It was a competent, well-executed raid. Under normal circumstances, it would have cost Ned's column a dozen men and a quantity of supplies before the scouts could respond. The armored figure was at the column's flank before anyone had fully registered the attack. What happened in the next 90 seconds was described differently by every man who witnessed it, because human memory, confronted with events that exceed its categories, tends to reconstruct them in fragments. What all accounts agreed on, the figure moved at a speed that made the mounted knights' horses shy and stumble despite themselves, their animal instincts registering something wrong before their riders could process what was happening. It struck the lead horse's rider from the saddle with a single open-handed blow that unhorsed him without killing him. It caught a lance thrust meant for its chest, caught it in one gauntlet hand, and used the momentum to unseat the lancer. 2 knights who tried to ride it down found their horses refusing to approach, the animals screaming and wheeling away from something there. Instincts correctly identified as a predator, of a different order entirely. The remaining 8 knights pulled back to the tree. The figure stood in the ford, watching them go, ankle-deep in the river current, holding the broken half of a Targaryen lance in one hand like a man who has absent-mindedly picked up a stick. Ned's column had gone completely silent. Lord Dustin said, from somewhere behind Ned's left shoulder, in a voice stripped entirely of its earlier diplomatic neutrality, 7 hells. Roderick Castle said nothing. He was watching the knights retreating into the tree with the expression of a man doing rapid military mathematics. "My lord," he said finally, "if we put that at the vanguard of a proper engagement." "I know," Ned said. "The effect on morale alone." "I know, Roderick." He watched the figure turn from the retreating knights and walk back to its position beside him, still carrying the broken lance, which it examined briefly and then dropped in the river with the mild disinterest of someone discarding a tool that had served its single purpose. It fell back into its walking place, 4 feet back and to Ned's left, and the column, after a moment of collective held breath, resumed its march. But something had changed. Ned could feel it in the air the way he felt weather changing in the north. A shift in atmospheric pressure, invisible and total. The whispers in the column were different now. Lord Dustin was no longer asking what it was. The men who had watched from the columns' edge were not maintaining the same invisible radius of unease. What they were doing instead, what Ned recognized with a complicated mixture of relief and caution, was orienting, the way men orient around a banner, the way soldiers find their courage in proximity to something that does not appear to have a ceiling on it. It was exactly what he needed for the Trident. It was also, he recognized, Exactly what Aerys Targaryen's spymaster had been told about and was almost certainly relaying to the Mad King in King's Landing right now, in a raven that would arrive before Ned's column reached the river. He thought about that for a long time as the column marched south through the riverlands. Gray afternoon, the Trident. Somewhere ahead, Robert's army somewhere ahead, and the Mad King's answer to all of it waiting in a city that Ned hoped. With the tight, controlled hope of a man who has learned not to want things too badly, they would reach before. Aerys decided that wildfire was a more elegant solution than soldiers. The figure walked beside him and said nothing, as it always said nothing. But when Ned's eyes moved north, reflexively, pulled by some instinct he couldn't name, he found the visor already facing south, already calculating, already, in whatever way this ancient, silent, terrible thing calculated, planning. The old gods had not sent him a weapon. They had sent him a general. The raven from King's Landing arrived in Robert Baratheon's war camp 3 days before the Trident, and it did not go to Robert. It went to Jon Arryn. Jon Arryn was 61 years old, silver-haired, careful, and possessed of the particular political intelligence that comes from decades of navigating the gap between what lords say and what they mean. He had fostered both Robert Baratheon and Ned Stark in the Aerys cold halls, had watched them grow from boys into the men who were now dismantling a dynasty, and had earned his place as the rebellion's quiet administrative spine, the man who wrote the letters. Robert was too impatient to write, brokered the alliances. Robert was too proud to personally negotiate, and read the ravens. Robert was too distracted to fully absorb. He read this one twice. Then he sent for Ned. Ned arrived at Jon Arryn's tent in the blue hour before full dark, when the war camp settled into its evening rhythms of fire and food, and the low constant murmur of men preparing themselves for the possibility of dying. The armored figure came with him. It had, without discussion or negotiation, established a pattern of accompanying Ned to significant meetings the way a shadow accompanies a man in sunlight, and Ned had stopped trying to redirect it. And the 2 guards outside Jon Arryn's tent went through a visible internal struggle before settling on the professional decision to pretend it wasn't there. Jon Arryn looked at the figure for a long moment when Ned entered. Then he looked at Ned with the expression he had worn when a 14-year-old Ned had done something that Jon recognized as simultaneously very intelligent and potentially catastrophic. "Sit down, Ned." Ned sat. The figure stood at the tent's entrance, as it always stood, watchful, patient, oriented toward the camp's perimeter, in the posture of something that treats every room as a potential battlefield and every entrance as a variable to be monitored. "Aerys knows," Jon Arryn said. "I expected that." "You expected it." Jon set the raven's message on the camp table between them. The message uses careful language, but the meaning is plain. The Mad King has received reports of an armored warrior in the northern column unlike anything in Westerosi knowledge. Reports of what it did at the ford 2 days ago have reached King's Landing already, which means Aerys has informants in your column, Ned, which is a problem we'll address separately. He paused. He's calling it a demon. His word or his spymaster's? His. Aerys has been. The reports from inside the Red Keep describe a man whose hold on reason has been loosening for months. The wildfire obsession has deepened. He has the alchemists' guild working day and night on, something he won't fully disclose to the small council. And now, Jon gestured at the message. He believes the old gods have sent a demon against him. He believes this is punishment for another pause. For what he did to your father and brother, Ned. The tent was quiet for a moment. He's not entirely wrong about the source, Ned said. No. Jon looked at the figure again. Which is theologically interesting and tactically concerning. Because a man who believes he is facing divine punishment tends to respond in one of 2 ways. He repents. The slight, dry inflection in Jon Arryn's voice communicated exactly how likely he considered this. Or he decides that if the gods are against him, he will burn the gods' world down before they can claim it. Ned thought about the wildfire caches. Every lord who had spent time near King's Landing thought about the wildfire caches eventually. They were the Mad King's ultimate answer to every problem. A network of ceramic vessels, buried beneath the city streets. Enough wildfire to turn King's Landing into a green-flamed pyre that would kill every living soul within its walls and burn. For days afterward, Ares had been refilling them for years. The Alchemist's Guild had been his instrument and his indulgence simultaneously. "We need to reach the city before he makes that decision," Ned said. "Yes." John Aaron folded his hands on the table. "Which means the Trident needs to be decisive. Not merely one, decisive. We cannot afford a prolonged engagement that gives Ares time to whatever he's planning." He looked at the figure one more time. "Robert has been asking about it. He wants to meet it." "I know. He's been calling it the God's War Night in his letters. With the capital G and everything." A faint, tired humor in John's voice. "You know Robert." Ned did know Robert. Robert Baratheon was the finest battlefield commander of his generation, a man of enormous physical courage and enormous personal charisma who inspired soldiers the way fire inspired moths, irresistibly and occasionally fatally. He was also a man who, when he encountered something extraordinary, immediately began calculating how to use it and how to celebrate it. In that order, and the distinction between those two impulses was not always as clear in Robert's mind as it might be. "Tomorrow," Ned said. "I'll bring it to Robert tomorrow." Robert Baratheon's reaction to the Doomslayer was, in its essentials, exactly what Ned had predicted and slightly worse in its specifics. He was enormous, as tall as the figure, broader through the chest, with the dark Baratheon hair and the booming laugh that his soldiers loved and his enemies had learned to fear, because men who laughed like that were either very confident or very dangerous. And Robert was generally both. He came out of his command tent with the rolling, purposeful stride of a man who owned every room he walked into by sheer force of personality. Saw the armored figure standing beside Ned, stopped dead for 3 full seconds, and then said, with tremendous feeling, "Gods." Then he walked directly to it. No hesitation, no cautious circling. Robert Baratheon had never in his life approached anything cautiously, and stopped 2 feet away and looked up at the visor with an expression of pure, unguarded delight. "It's bigger than I thought from the ravens," he said to Ned, without looking away from the figure. "The reports said large. I thought they meant large for a northerner. Large like you." "This is," he seemed to be searching for the right word. "This is correct. This is what a warrior sent by God should look like." He looked at the blank visor. "Can it understand me?" "Yes," Ned said. "Can it speak?" "Not that I've heard." Robert absorbed this. "A warrior who doesn't boast," he said, with what sounded like genuine respect. "The gods have a sense of irony." He took a step back and studied the figure, with the eye of a man who had evaluated soldiers his entire adult life. "The ford. I heard about the ford. 12 mounted knights. And it unhorsed 2 by hand, and broke a lance, and the rest ran." "Yes." "Show me," Robert said to the figure. The figure looked at him. "Not the lance," Robert clarified, with the slightly impatient air of someone who considers this obvious. "The speed. The men's reports were." He made a gesture. "I want to see it with my own eyes. Because I'm going to ask it to do something at the Trident, and I need to understand what I'm asking." What happened next became one of the stories the rebellions veterans told for the rest of their lives. Embellished, disputed, retold in taverns across the 7 kingdoms in the decades that followed. The figure looked at Robert Baratheon for a moment. Then it moved. It crossed 20 feet of open ground in the time it took Robert to blink. Stopped directly behind him. Was back in its original position before Robert had fully turned around. Robert Baratheon stood very still for a moment. Then he laughed, the full, rolling, genuine laugh that his soldiers loved, and turned to Ned with an expression of profound satisfaction. "Tell John Aaron to update the battle plan," he said. "I want this at the Trident. Not at the flank. Not in reserve. At the Trident." The battle plan that John Aaron, Ned Stark, and Robert Baratheon's war council assembled over the following 2 days was a conventional Westerosi engagement in all its broad strokes. Cavalry on the flanks, infantry at the center, archers positioned on the higher ground of the eastern bank. The Trident's crossing would be contested. Rhaegar's forces held the western bank and would need to be broken before the ford could be taken. What was not conventional was the element John Aaron quietly inserted into the plan's most critical phase. Rhaegar Targaryen would be at the center of the royal host. Every intelligence report confirmed it. The crown prince in his silver armor, with the rubies on his breastplate that the bards had already turned into poetry, leading his father's forces personally in the way that Targaryens of the old blood led, from the front, commanding by presence as much as by strategy. He was a brilliant man, by all accounts, a warrior of genuine skill, a prince who might, in different circumstances, have been a king worth serving. He was also the man who had taken Lyanna Stark. Ned had thought very carefully, in the long marching hours south through the Riverlands, about what he wanted from the Trident. He had thought about honor and justice and the difference between them, about what a rebellion needed versus what a brother needed, about the gap between the outcome that served the realm and the outcome that served his grief. He had not reached a clean conclusion. He rarely did. What he had reached was a tactical understanding. Rhaegar at the Trident's center was the battle's hinge. Break him, not kill, necessarily. Not if it could be avoided. Because dead princes complicated successions and complicated successions cost lives, but break him. Break the royal host's center, and the flanks would collapse. The battle would end. The march to King's Landing could begin before Aerys had time to make his decision about the wildfire. The armored figure had listened to the entire war council from its position at the tent's entrance. When the council dispersed, Ned sat alone with the maps for a long time, and the figure remained, and in the silence Ned said, without looking up from the Trident's drawn lines, "You understand what we're asking." The figure said nothing. The man at the center, the silver armor, the rubies. Ned paused. He matters. For what comes after. We need him broken, not dead, if it's possible, to manage that distinction in the middle of a battle. He finally looked up at the visor. Can you manage that distinction? The figure looked at him for a long moment. Then, with the deliberate precision of something communicating in the only language currently available to it, it tilted its head slightly, the minimal acknowledgement Ned had learned over the marching days to read as yes, I understand. I will account for this variable. Ned held the gaze for another moment. There's something else, he said. The scout reports from the Kingswood. The dead men. The things that don't match Westerosi weapons. He watched the visor carefully. Is that what I think it is? The stillness that answered him was different from ordinary silence. It was the stillness of confirmation, the held breath of a thing that has been waiting for the humans around it to ask the right question. Then the Trident first, Ned said quietly. And after King's Landing, he looked north, through the tent's canvas wall, through the miles and the rebellion and the Mad King's wildfire, and all the urgent mortal politics between here and the wall. After King's Landing, we go north. The figure held his gaze. Outside, the camp settled into the last night before the Trident, and fires burned low against the dark. And somewhere to the west the river ran cold and fast, toward a crossing where history was about to be made, or broken, or both. As Westerosi history had a habit of being, the Trident ran red before the sun reached midday. It ran red the way rivers run red in the songs, which is to say, not cleanly or dramatically, but in the slow, ugly, accumulating way of actual battle, where bodies fall in the shallows and the current does its indifferent work and the color spreads downstream faster than news travels upstream. The ford was 200 yards wide at the crossing point, knee-deep at its shallowest and chest-deep in the channels. And by the time Robert Baratheon's center engaged the royal host's vanguard, the water was already compromised, slippery with mud churned by 10,000 boots, running dark with what the surgeons would later account for in grim administrative language. Ned Stark fought at the eastern bank's edge, where the Stark banners and the Tully Crimson held the line, against a Targaryen cavalry push that was competent and disciplined, and ultimately insufficient. He fought the way he always fought, carefully, without flourish, with the economic precision of a man who had learned that battles were won by men who didn't make mistakes rather than men who made brilliant gestures. Roderick Castle fought at his shoulder. Howland Reed moved through the shallows like smoke, appearing at moments of crisis and disappearing before anyone could account for him. The armored figure was at the center. Ned could track it from the eastern bank by the way the battle moved around it. A distortion in the royal host's line, a place where the Targaryen advance folded and buckled and failed to advance. a gap that shouldn't have existed in a formation of that size and discipline. He could track it by sound, too, in the moments when the engagement around him quieted enough to hear across the water. A rhythmic percussion of impact that had no equivalent in normal battle noise. The sound of something, hitting things with more force than the things were designed to absorb. He could track it, most clearly by watching Rhaegar Targaryen. The Crown Prince was exactly where intelligence had placed him. Silver armor catching the gray river light, dark hair beneath an open visor, moving through his own forces, with the controlled authority of a commander managing a deteriorating situation. And the situation was deteriorating because something was moving through his center that his commanders had not planned for, and his soldiers had no framework to address. Ned watched Rhaegar's head turn toward the disturbance in his line, watched him make the calculation that every general makes when a battle stops going according to plan, watched him make the decision. Rhaegar Targaryen rode toward the center of his own collapsing line. What happened at the Trident's center was reconstructed afterward from perhaps 40 eyewitness accounts, which agreed on almost nothing except the broad outline and the rubies. The songs would say Robert Baratheon killed Rhaegar at the Trident, drove his warhammer into the prince's chest with such force that the rubies of his armor shattered and scattered across the river, and the crown prince of the Seven Kingdoms fell into the water with the stones of his breastplate spreading around him like dying stars. The songs were not entirely wrong. Robert was there, Robert's hammer was there, and the rubies were real. They were found for years afterward by rivermen working that stretch of the Trident, small red stones catching the light in the shallows. What the songs did not include, because no bard had been present and the men who had been present were reluctant to complicate a narrative that served the new regime so cleanly, was what happened in the 30 seconds before Robert's hammer fell. The armored figure had reached Rhaegar first. Not to kill him. Ned's instruction had been clear, and whatever the figure was, it had demonstrated in every engagement since the fort a precise, almost surgical control over how much force it applied and to what end. It reached Rhaegar in the middle of his own shattered center, surrounded by dead and dying royal guardsmen who had put themselves between their prince and this thing that moved like nothing they had ever trained to face. And it did not draw the long sword it had been carrying since Winterfell. It took Rhaegar's horse, the war horse, a gray destrier of genuine quality, trained for battle, not given to panic, simply stopped, functioning as a cavalry mount when the figure grabbed its bridle, not from injury, from the same animal instinct that had made the knights. Horses refused to approach at the ford, the deep, pre-rational recognition of something that existed higher on a hierarchy of threat than anything the horse's nervous system had been designed to process. The destrier locked all four legs and refused to move, and Rhaegar, caught between a stationary horse and an advancing figure that was already reaching for him, made the only choice available. He dismounted and drew his sword. The accounts differed on what followed. The most credible reconstruction from a royal guardsman who survived with significant injuries and gave his account to a maester at a Rivellin's holdfast 3 months later, clearly expecting no one to believe him, described 2 exchanges. In the first, Rhaegar attacked with the considerable skill of a man who had trained with the best sword masters in Westeros since boyhood, and the figure deflected both strikes with its gauntlet forearm in a way that the guardsman described as like watching a man brush away flies, except that the flies were Rhaegar Targaryen. In the second exchange, the figure caught Rhaegar's sword arm at the wrist, applied pressure that the guardsman described as controlled, not savage, the way a man restrains a child rather than the way he breaks an enemy. And Rhaegar went to one knee in the Trident's shallows. He was there, kneeling, sword gone, when Robert Baratheon came through what remained of the royal center with his warhammer and the accumulated fury of a man who had been fighting toward this moment since Lyanna's disappearance. What Robert saw was his enemy on his knees in the river. What he felt, in the fraction of a second before the hammer fell, was something Ned would ask him about only once, years later, in a quiet moment at Winterfell, and Robert's answer was characteristically blunt. I felt like someone had done half my work for me, and I was angry about it, and I hit him anyway. The hammer connected with Rhaegar's chest. The rubies scattered, The crown prince of the 7 kingdoms fell into the Trident, and the royal host center, already broken, collapsed entirely. The battle was over before the sun reached the western tree-line. Robert found Ned at the river's edge as the surgeons began their grim accounting, and the ravens were being prepared with the news that would reshape the 7 kingdoms. He was in a complicated mood, the specific complicated mood of a man who has achieved the thing he has spent years fighting toward and discovered that achievement and satisfaction are not the same emotion. He stood beside Ned and looked at the water and said nothing for a while, which was unusual enough for Robert Baratheon that Ned waited him out. It held back, Robert finally said. Yes. It could have killed him. Yes. Robert was quiet again. The river moved past them, indifferent and continuous. Jon says we march on King's Landing within the week. Tywin Lannister is already moving. The Westerland's host is 3 days from the city. He paused. Tywin sat out this whole war, Ned. Watched both sides bleed. And now he's marching when the outcome is certain. The contempt in Robert's voice was old and thorough. He'll sack the city before we can reach it. I know. Which means Aerys will. Robert stopped. He looked sideways at Ned with the expression he wore when he was about to say something. He'd been thinking for longer than the conversation suggested. The wildfire. You think he'll use it? I think he'll try. Can that? Robert gestured vaguely toward where the armored figure was standing at the battle's periphery, watching the surgeons work with the attentive, cataloging patients it directed at everything. Can it survive wildfire? It was the question Ned had been turning over since Maester Whaleys' texts and the Mad King's reported. Obsession had converged in his thinking. Wildfire was not fire in the ordinary sense, not even dragon fire, which was magical and ancient and terrible, but which operated under rules the world understood. Wildfire was alchemical, a substance that burned through stone and steel and water and did not stop, that clung and spread and consumed with a mindlessness that made it almost cosmological in its indifference. Ned did not know if it had an analog in whatever dimension the figure had come from. He did not know what the preacher suit's tolerance was for a substance that burned through things that weren't supposed to burn. I don't know, he said honestly. Right. Robert looked at the figure again. The setting sun was catching the damaged armor in a way that made the scoring and scarring on its surface more visible than usual. The evidence of whatever it had been doing before the weirwood pulled it here. The accumulated record of engagements in a war neither of them could fully imagine. Here's what I know. Tywin will reach the city first. Aerys will either open the gates to the man who spent the whole war waiting to see who'd win, or he'll burn the city around himself and take everyone with him. Either way, we ride at dawn, Ned said. We ride at dawn. Robert paused. And Ned, the complicated mood was back, sitting in his voice like weather. Rhaegar. Was that? He seemed to be searching for a question he wasn't sure he wanted the answer to. At the end, when it had him on his knees. Before I came through. Did it? Was there a moment where it could have? Yes, Ned said quietly. There was a moment. Why didn't it? Ned looked at the figure across the field, at the blank visor turned toward the western horizon where King's Landing waited 3 days hard ride away. He thought about the Godswood and the Weirwood's split face and the old gods. Purposeful silence. He thought about what Maester Whaleys had said about instruments. He thought about the scout reports from the Kingswood and the things that didn't match. Westerosi weapons. Because it understands what we need from this war, he said. A dead Rhaegar today complicates everything we need to do next. It knew that. Robert absorbed this. It knew that. Yes. Another long silence. The river moved. The ravens were written and sealed. Somewhere in the camp a soldier was singing something slow and grateful. The kind of song men sang when they'd survived something they weren't sure they would. Gods, Ned, Robert said finally. Not with his usual booming effect. Quietly, genuinely. What did the old gods pull out of that tree? It was not really a question. Ned didn't answer it as one. He looked north, as he increasingly found himself looking north, past the riverlands and the neck and the wall and everything. The wall had been built to hold back. He thought about the scout, reports and Howland reads. Crannogmen hearing the Weirwoods speak and the figure's absolute, consistent orientation toward the northern horizon, whenever politics and battles didn't Demand its attention elsewhere. Something that's been fighting for a very long time, he said. Something the old gods decided. We need it before what's coming in the north actually arrives. Robert said nothing. The sun finished setting over the Trident. Somewhere downstream, unseen and indifferent, the rubies of Rhaegar Targaryen's breastplate caught the last light in the shallows and glittered like small dying stars. Tywin Lannister reached King's Landing 2 days before Ned Stark. This was not an accident. The Lord of Casterly Rock had spent the entirety of Robert's rebellion performing the most elegant political calculation in Westerosi. Recent memory, committing nothing, risking nothing, watching the Mad King and the rebellion bleed each other toward a conclusion, and then marching the Westerlands host with precise timing toward the winning side at the precise moment. That the winning side's victory was no longer in doubt. It was, by any measure of cold political intelligence, a masterwork. It was also, by any measure of honor, the most cynical act of opportunism the Seven Kingdoms had witnessed in a generation. The gates of King's Landing opened for Tywin Lannister because Aerys Targaryen believed, until the moment the Lannister host poured through them, that Tywin had come to defend him. By the time Ned's column reached the King's Road's final approach to the city, the sack was already underway. They smelled it before they saw it. Smoke, the thick, complex smoke of a city burning in multiple places simultaneously, riding the wind south, along the road with the particular intimacy of disaster delivering its own advance notice. Then the sound came, carried on the same wind, not the ordered noise of battle, but the chaotic, layered sound of a city in violent crisis, soldiers and civilians, and fire all occupying the same acoustic space in the way that catastrophes produced and orderly engagements did not. Then they crested the King's Road's last rise and saw the city. 3 distinct fire columns were rising from within the walls. The Lion Gate stood open, Lannister banners visible from distance. The city's own gold cloaks were in various states of confusion that could be read even from a mile away in the quality of their movement, some fighting, some fleeing, some standing in the particular paralysis of men whose chain of command had just catastrophically dissolved. Above it all, the Red Keep sat on Aegon's high hill like a crown on a hill over a burning head. Its towers intact, but its lower approaches already showing Lannister crimson at the gates. Ned looked at the city for perhaps 5 seconds. Then he looked at the armored figure riding beside him. They had procured a horse 3 days into the march south. A massive destrier from the Trident's captured remounts. That was the only animal in the column that had tolerated its rider without extended protest, and said, the wildfire. The figure was already looking at the city, not at the fires visible above the walls, at something Ned couldn't see from this distance, some reading of the situation that its particular experience provided, and that Ned was learning, gradually, to trust even when he couldn't follow its reasoning. It turned to him. The caches, Ned said, beneath the city. If they ignite, he didn't finish the sentence. Everyone in the column knew what wildfire beneath King's Landing meant. They had all been knowing it for months. In the specific way soldiers know about catastrophic possibilities, aware, carefully not dwelling on it, hoping the professionals involved would manage it before it became real. The figure looked at the city for another moment. Then it swung down from the destrier with the fluid ease that still, after weeks, produced involuntary reactions in anyone watching, and began to run, not toward the Lion Gate, toward the walls directly, the city walls, massive and ancient, 30 feet of stone that had never been designed to stop what was currently crossing toward them. Ned stared for exactly as long as it took him to understand what he was watching. Roderick, he said, my lord, take the column to the Lion Gate. Find Lord Tywin. Tell him the Lord of Winterfell is here and requires an immediate accounting of Lannister forces position relative to the. He was already moving, already spurring his horse toward the walls, calculating the angles relative to the lower city, the street of steel, the dragon pit approach. Roderick's voice came after him. My lord. Go, Roderick. He rode hard for the wall. The Doom Slayer went over the city wall the way water goes over a low barrier. Not through it, not around it, over it, scaling 30 feet of ancient stone in the time it took Ned's horse to cover 200 yards of approach. The guards on the wall walk above simply moved aside, which was the correct instinct and the one Ned was grateful for because it avoided a complication he had no time to manage. He reached the gate at the wall's base a minute later, demanding entrance from gold cloaks, who were too disoriented by the sack's chaos to mount meaningful resistance to a northern lord with Stark banners and the particular authority of a man who had just won a war. They let him through. Inside, King's Landing was everything the smoke and sound had promised. The Lannister sack was not the systematic, disciplined operation that Tywin Lannister's reputation might have suggested. It was the organized crime of a professional army that had been given implicit permission to do what professional armies do when they enter a city whose leadership has collapsed, which is to say, it was structured enough to have objectives, and chaotic enough that the pursuit of those objectives left significant room for the pursuit of other things. The Street of Steel was burning. The lower city's tavern district was worse. Civilian screams provided a continuous background register beneath the soldiers' shouting and the fire's steady consumption of the city's older, drier districts. Ned rode through it with the expression he wore in crises: closed, contained, furious in a way that only people who knew him well could read, heading for the Red Keep's approach, and the figure he had, lost in the chaos of the wall. He found it 3 streets from the Red Keep's lower gate. It was standing in the entrance to what had once been a cellar access, an arched doorway in a city block's foundation, the kind of anonymous urban infrastructure that existed in thousands in a city King's Landing's size. The door had been removed at some point recently, by the look of the fresh splintering on the frame. The figure was standing at the entrance, looking down into the darkness below with the specific, focused stillness it adopted when it had found something relevant. Ned dismounted, tied his horse to an iron ring, walked to the entrance, and looked down. The smell reached him before his eyes adjusted. Sharp, chemical, wrong in a way that had nothing to do with smoke or blood or the ordinary olfactory landscape of a city in crisis. It was the smell of wildfire, not burning wildfire, the smell of wildfire stored, contained in its ceramic vessels, the alchemical compound, sitting in the specific unstable readiness that the Alchemists' Guild maintained through careful temperature management and absolutely did not maintain under conditions of a city being sacked in midsummer. The cellar below was full of it, not a small cache, a substantial one, ceramic vessels the size of barrels, packed in the careful arrangements the Guild used, glowing faintly with the substance's own bioluminescent quality in the underground dark. Ned counted 12 vessels, visible from the entrance before the darkness defeated his estimation. There were almost certainly more beyond. Ned looked at the figure. The figure looked at the cellar. "You knew this was here," Ned said. Not accusation, recognition. The figure turned its visor toward him briefly, that minimal acknowledgement, and then looked back at the cellar. It was doing the thing Ned had watched it do before every engagement since Winterfell: cataloging, calculating, arriving at a tactical assessment with the methodical patience of something that had processed a very large number of dangerous situations and developed reliable frameworks for evaluating them. Then it stepped down into the cellar. Ned followed, because there was no version of Ned Stark that waited at the entrance while someone else managed the thing he had ridden into a burning city to address. The cellar was larger than the entrance suggested, a vaulted space that ran beneath at least 2 city blocks, supported by columns of old stone that King's Landing's original builders had laid when the city was young. The wildfire vessels occupied one end of the space in their careful arrangements. At the other end, 2 alchemists, guild members, in their distinctive pale robes, were doing something at a central work table that Ned could not immediately identify, but which made his stomach tighten with a cold, specific dread. They looked up when the figure descended into the cellar. One of them ran immediately, bolted for a far entrance Ned hadn't seen, disappeared into the darkness beyond. The other stood his ground with the expression of a man who had made a decision he was committed to and was not going to be deterred by an armored giant regardless of what the armored giant was. The king commanded it, the alchemist said. His voice was steady in the way that true believers' voices were steady, not brave. Exactly, but conviction steadied. If the city falls, the city burns. Those were his words. Those are his words. Ned looked at the work table, saw the prepared igniters, saw the arrangement of the nearest vessels relative to the columns, an arrangement that was not accidental storage but deliberate placement, the geometry of someone who understood how to maximize a chain reaction in an enclosed space. The king is, Ned paused on the word dead, because he didn't actually know yet what had happened to Ares. The king's authority is at an end. This is over. The king commanded. The figure moved past Ned with 2 strides and took the igniters off the table with the same efficient, decisive motion it applied to everything. No drama, no announcement. Just the removal of the immediate problem from the immediate situation. The alchemist reached for them, reflexively, and the figure held them above its head and looked down at the man with an expression that obviously communicated, even through a blank visor, that reaching further would be an error in judgment. The alchemist did not reach further. How many caches? Ned said to him. Total. In the city. Silence. How many caches? The alchemist's conviction-steadied voice developed a crack. 47, he said. Distributed across the lower city. The Street of Steel approach. The Dragon Pit district, and he stopped. And where else? Beneath the red keep itself. Barely audible. The throne room. The small council chamber. Ned looked at the figure. The figure was already looking at him. We need to find Jaime Lannister, Ned said. They found him in the throne room. Not fighting toward it. Already there, already done. In the specific aftermath of an irrevocable action, Jaime Lannister sat on the steps of the Iron Throne with his golden hair dark with sweat, and his white Kingsguard cloak, marked with blood that was not his own. And before him on the throne room floor lay Aerys II Targaryen, the Mad King, with a Kingsguard sword through his back. Jaime looked up when Ned and the figure entered. He was 19 years old. He had the face of someone who had just done something that he knew the world would never fully understand, and had already begun the process of deciding whether to be ashamed of it or not. His eyes went to the figure first. They always did. Everyone's did, and then to Ned. Lord Stark, he said. His voice was even, deliberately even, the voice of a man, maintaining control because the alternative was something he wasn't prepared to face in a throne room in front of a stranger. Ned looked at Aerys. At Jaime. At the throne room's grate. Windows where the smoke of the sax fires made the afternoon light thick and amber. The wildfire, Ned said. The caches. Jaime's jaw tightened. He was going to burn the city. All of it. He'd been planning it for months. The arrangement. The triggers. He stopped. Looked down at his hands. I told him to surrender. I told him the city was lost. He called for Rossart. He glanced at a second body near the throne room's far wall. Pale-robed, Alchemist's Guild. Rossart was going to light the first cache. It would have taken everything else with it. Ned looked at the figure. The figure was looking at Jaime Lannister with an attention that Ned had learned to read as recognition. The look it gave, things it categorized as significant, as relevant to assessments it was continuously running. It looked at the dead king, at the dead alchemist, at the young knight sitting on the iron throne steps with blood on his cloak and the weight of what he'd done settling onto him in real time. The other caches, Ned said to Jaime. 47 locations. We need guild members who know the arrangements. Rossart knew them all. Jaime nodded at the dead alchemist. There are 2 others still in the city. Bellies and Garrigus. If the Lannister soldiers haven't, he didn't finish. Ned turned to the figure. Can you find them before someone else does? The figure looked at him, then at Jaime. Then, without any further communication, it turned and walked out of the throne room at a pace that would have required Ned to run to match. Ned watched it go. Then he looked back at Jaime Lannister, sitting in the blood and the amber light, and said the thing that needed saying even though it would cost something to say it. You saved the city. Jaime looked up at him. Something moved in the young knight's expression, not gratitude, exactly. Something more complicated. Something that had to do with the word saved being true and also insufficient for the thing it was describing. Tell that to the history books, he said. Ned had no answer for that. He wasn't sure one existed. Outside, the fires were already beginning to come under control as the Lannister soldiers' worst impulses were reined in by officers who understood that Tywin's political position required a city still standing. The smoke above King's Landing thinned slightly, not gone, not even close to gone, but reduced from catastrophe toward merely crisis. Somewhere in the lower city, the armored figure was moving through the chaos toward two alchemists who held the keys to 44 more caches. And the city was not burning. And Ned Stark stood in the throne room where Aegon the Conqueror had once forged his seat of power from the swords of his enemies and thought about what it meant that the realm had been saved twice in one afternoon, once by a 19-year-old knight who would be called Kingslayer for it, and once by something that had come through a weirwood tree and could not even tell him its name. Robert Baratheon sat the Iron Throne for the first time 3 days after the sack, and he hated it immediately. This was not a surprise to anyone who knew him well. The throne was not designed for comfort. Aegon the Conqueror had made certain of that, had reportedly said that a king who sat easily on his throne had forgotten what it cost. And Robert was a man built for motion, for the open field and the hunt and the weight of a warhammer in his hands, not for the particular stationary misery of a seat made from 1,000 swords with edges that caught the light and reminded everyone present that the thing they were looking at was fundamentally a weapon dressed up as furniture. He shifted twice in the first 10 minutes of his first small council session, drew blood from his left hand on a protruding blade edge, and spent the remainder of the meeting with a wrapped hand and an expression of profound dissatisfaction. That had nothing to do with the council's agenda. The agenda was substantial. Jon Arryn had prepared it with his usual thorough precision. The formal dissolution of Targaryen royal authority, the disposition of loyalist lords who had surrendered, the question of Rhaegar's surviving children at Dragonstone, Viserys, and the infant Daenerys, whose existence was a political problem that everyone at the table was being very careful about how they discussed, and approximately 40 secondary items that would consume the small council's attention. For months, Jon Arryn moved through them with measured efficiency. Lord Tywin, who had positioned himself at Robert's right hand with the territorial confidence of a man claiming a seat that had not been formally offered observations that were helpful and precise and never quite allowed anyone to forget that the Lannister host was still the largest armed force currently inside the city walls. Ned sat at the table and said very little and watched everything. The armored figure stood at the throne room's entrance. It had been there since Robert's procession, having taken a position at the great doors with the quiet, unchallengeable authority of something that did not require permission to stand where it stood. The gold cloaks who normally held that post had shuffled aside with the philosophical pragmatism of men who had been through a great deal recently and were choosing their battles carefully. Every member of the small council had looked at it at least once during the session. Tywin Lannister had looked at it 3 times, which Ned noted because Tywin Lannister did not look at things 3 times without reason. The session was nearing its end when Tywin said, with the deceptive casualness of a man who has been waiting for exactly the right moment to raise exactly the right subject. There is one matter not on Lord Arryn's list. Jon Arryn looked up from his papers. My lord, the matter of the creature at the door. Tywin's voice was what it always was, measured, cold, carrying the absolute certainty of a man who had never fully accepted that the world contained things outside his management. He did not look at the figure when he said it. He looked at Robert. It fought at the Trident. It secured the wildfire caches during the sack. It has been present at every significant military action since the Northern Army joined the rebellion. He paused, in the way that Tywin Lannister paused, not from uncertainty, but for effect. It has no fealty sworn, no house, no lord it answers to, no position in the realm's hierarchy. Another pause. That is a problem. Robert looked at Ned. Ned looked at Tywin. It answers to the old gods, Ned said, which puts it outside the realm's hierarchy by definition. Nothing is outside the realm's hierarchy, Tywin said. That is what hierarchy means. Whatever this thing is, it operates within the boundaries of this realm and therefore within the boundaries of this realm's governance. It must swear fealty to the crown, or it must be classified as an ungoverned military force operating on Westerosi soil. Which is what? Robert said. There was an edge in his voice, not anger. Exactly, but the particular sharpness Robert deployed when someone was trying to outthink him in a direction he didn't want to go. A threat, Tywin said simply. regardless of its recent service. Ungoverned military capacity is always a threat. My Lord King. The title was precise, correct, and somehow still managed to contain the infinitesimal suggestion of a man trying it on. You have just won a war in part because of this creature's involvement. The realm owes it a debt, but debts can be honored in ways that also establish governance. Bring it into the crown's service formally. Give it a position, a title, a chain of accountability. He finally looked at the figure at the door. Controlled. It is an asset beyond anything this kingdom has possessed since the last dragon. Uncontrolled. It's not a dragon, Robert said. No, it's something we understand. Considerably less. Tywin looked back at the king. Which makes it more concerning, not less. The throne room was quiet for a moment. The morning light came through the high windows at the angle that made the Iron Throne's blades catch and scatter it across the floor in thin, bright lines. Ned said, "It doesn't swear oaths." Everyone looked at him. "I've had weeks to observe it," Ned said. "It cooperates. It assists. It acts in alignment with objectives it considers worthwhile. But it doesn't operate within hierarchies of command. It operates within hierarchies of purpose. You cannot make it yours, my lord." He met Tywin's gaze. "You can only pursue goals it considers worth pursuing." Tywin regarded him with the expression he wore when someone had said something accurate that he found inconvenient. Then whose goals does it consider worth pursuing currently? Ned thought about the northward glances. The scout reports from the Kingswood, Maester Whaley's fragmentary texts about the living flame and the devouring dark. That, he said, is exactly the right question. Peter Baelish found Ned 2 nights later. This was not a coincidence. Nothing Peter Baelish did was a coincidence. He had been appointed to a minor customs position in the Vale under Jon Arryn's patronage and had leveraged it with such systematic intelligence and calculated charm that he had arrived in King's Landing ahead of the rebellion's resolution and was already, in the 3 days since Robert took the throne, positioning himself for whatever role the new regime's administrative reorganization would create. He was 24 years old, slight, dark-haired, with the kind of face that was easy to underestimate because it was designed to be. Quick eyes behind an expression of perpetual mild amusement. The smile of a man who found everything slightly funnier than everyone else. Because he was seeing a level of the joke they weren't. He found Ned in the Red Keep's Godswood, a smaller, less impressive version of Winterfell's, a concession to northern traditions that some long ago Targaryen had made and that subsequent Targaryens had maintained without enthusiasm. The weirwood here was young by northern standards, its carved face shallow and recent-looking, its sap running slowly in the King's Landing heat. The armored figure was standing at the Godswood's edge. It was always near weirwoods when given the choice. Ned had noticed this weeks ago and had been sitting with what it meant. Baelish looked at the figure for a moment, then at Ned, then back at the figure with an expression that was, for once, not quite managing the amused detachment. "Remarkable," he said, quietly enough that it sounded almost genuine. Then the expression reassembled itself. "Lord Stark, I hope I'm not intruding." "You are," Ned said. "What do you want, Lord Baelish?" Baelish smiled at the directness the way some men smile at weather, acknowledging it without being altered by it. "To offer something, and to ask something, in whichever order you prefer." "Ask. What is it?" He nodded at the figure. "Not the official answer. Not the old god sent it. What is it actually?" "I don't fully know," Ned said. "I think you know more than you're sharing with the small council." Baelish's voice was conversational. "I think Maester Whaley's has been writing you letters from Winterfell since you marched south. I think the Crannogman's Lord, Reed, isn't it, has been sharing interpretations of old god texts that would make the Citadel's senior maesters deeply uncomfortable. And I think," he paused, with the timing of a man who has rehearsed this, "I think you're not sleeping well because of what you know is north of the wall, and what you believe that thing was brought here to address." Ned looked at him steadily. "What is it you're offering?" "Information." Baelish spread his hands in a gesture of generous openness that Ned instinctively categorized as theater. "I have been, in my modest customs capacity, developing relationships with merchants who operate routes through the free cities, Bravos primarily, and through Bravosi channels. I have been made aware of correspondence between certain individuals at the Citadel, very senior individuals, and the Iron Bank, regarding reports from their northern network. He paused. Reports of movement beyond the wall. Movement that the Citadel's official position dismisses as wildling activity, but that the Iron Bank's actuaries are apparently treating rather more seriously. The bank has been quietly adjusting its long-term lending models for northern Westerosi lords for 2 years. The Godswood was very quiet. The Iron Bank doesn't adjust lending models for wildlings, Ned said. No, Baelish agreed pleasantly. It doesn't. He looked at the figure again. Whatever that is, whatever you know about what's coming, I want to be on the right side of it. Not Robert's side, not Tywin's side. He met Ned's eyes with an openness that was either genuine or the finest performance of sincerity Ned had encountered. The side that's still standing when winter actually comes. Ned studied him for a long moment. Peter Baelish was dangerous in a way that was entirely different from Tywin Lannister's danger. Tywin was a battering ram, massive and direct and devastating. Baelish was a lockpick, precise and patient and capable of opening things that were supposed to stay closed. He was also, in this moment, telling the truth about the Iron Bank. Ned could feel it with the same instinct that had learned to read the figure's minimal communications. The quality of information, too specific and too inconvenient to be invented. I'll consider what you've said, Ned told him. Baelish smiled. That's all I ask. He turned to leave, then paused, a choreographed pause. Ned was almost certain, but the words that followed were not. Lord Stark. The Kingswood. The reports from the sack's aftermath. Soldiers finding things in the outer districts that the gold cloaks are attributing to the chaos of the sack. He didn't look back. They're not from the sack. We both know that. A beat. Whatever followed that thing through the wall's resonance, it's already here. It came south with the army. He walked out of the Godswood. Ned stood very still for a moment. Then he looked at the figure. The figure was already looking at him. Had been looking at him, he realized, since Baelish began speaking, not at Baelish. At Ned, with the attention of something monitoring for the moment. When the human it had been placed beside would finally hear something. It had been trying to communicate without words. Since the Godswood at Winterfell, the weirwood behind them wept its slow sap down the carved face. You knew, Ned said. Since the Kingswood. Since before the Trident. He felt the cold settle into the Godswood despite King's Landing's heat. It followed you here. The figure said nothing, but it looked south, for the first time since Winterfell. Not north, south, toward the city's outer districts, where the gold cloaks were filing reports that no one wanted to read carefully, and Ned understood, with the absolute clarity of a man who has been given all the pieces and has finally arranged them correctly, that the rebellion had not been the war the old gods had armed them for. It had been the preparation. The first white in King's Landing was found in the Flea Bottom Tannery District on a Thursday. The gold cloak who filed the report was a 17-year veteran named Ser Allardyne, not yet the man he would eventually become, but already possessed of the useful quality of writing down what he actually saw rather than what he wished he had seen. His report described a body found by a tanner's apprentice in the pre-dawn hours, seated against a district wall in a posture suggesting rest. That upon approach proved to be a man who had been dead for approximately 3 days and was nevertheless. The report used the word ambulatory, which suggested Ser Aller had borrowed a maester's vocabulary for the occasion, moving, not quickly, not purposefully, in any direction that suggested intelligence, but moving in the way that a thing moves when something other than its own will is operating its body. The apprentice had run. Ser Aller had investigated. The gold cloak patrol that responded had killed it with some difficulty. It did not respond to wounds the way living men responded to wounds, and the 2 patrolmen who had engaged it closely had burns on their arms from the torch they had eventually used, fire being the thing that finally stopped it, and had filed the report, and then, following the instinct of men who have seen something they cannot explain, had said nothing to anyone except their immediate superior, who had said nothing to anyone except the commander of the city watch, who had said nothing to anyone at all because he was a practical man who understood that reports of walking dead men in a city that had just finished being sacked were not Reports that a new king trying to establish legitimacy and order needed to receive. In his first week on the throne, the report went into a file. There were 4 more incidents in the following week. Ned found out about them from Varys. The Master of Whisperers had survived the transition from Targaryen to Baratheon rule with a smoothness that was either deeply impressive or deeply alarming, depending on how much time you spent thinking about what it implied. He had served Aerys. He was now serving Robert. He had, in the gap between those 2 allegiances, apparently served the transition itself, quietly ensuring that certain loyalist lords received certain pieces of information that accelerated their surrender, that certain dangerous individuals found themselves neutralized before they could complicate the peace, that the machinery of governance continued to function through the regime change with minimum disruption. He was bald, soft-spoken, and perfumed, and he moved through the Red Keep's corridors with the unhurried ease of a man who had long ago made peace with the fact that everyone found him unsettling. He came to Ned's chambers in the Tower of the Hand. Jon Arryn had given Ned the apartments pending the formal appointment, which Robert had been pressing for, and Ned had been resisting with the quiet, persistent stubbornness. That was his particular form of political resistance. In the middle afternoon, alone, carrying nothing, and said, "I wonder if I might have a word." Lord Stark, with the pleasant intonation of a man making a social call. Ned let him in. The figure was in the corner of the outer chamber. It was always somewhere proximate. Varys looked at it with the expression he wore for things he had not yet fully analyzed. Not fear, not awe, but the careful attentiveness of a man storing observations for later processing. "Extraordinary," he said softly, almost to himself. Then, to Ned, "I won't insult you by pretending this is a casual visit." "What do you know?" Ned said. "A great deal, unfortunately." Varys settled into a chair with the neat, compact movements of a man comfortable in other people's rooms. The Gold Watch reports. First, 5 incidents in the Flea Bottom District and the Outer Tanneries. Walking Dead, Lord Stark. Not the confused and frightened Walking Dead of Ghost stories and old wives' tales. The purposeful, directional Walking Dead of something that is testing a city's response to its presence. He folded his hands in his lap. The incidents are escalating. The first was 1 body. The most recent, 3 days ago, was 4, moving together, in the same direction. Which direction? Ned said, though he already knew. North, Varys said. Through the city, toward the northern walls. A pause, as though something beyond those walls was calling them back. The chamber was quiet, except for the city's ambient noise, filtering through the tower's windows. King's Landing reassembling its ordinary life over the wreckage of the sack with the pragmatic resilience of a city that had been through bad things before and had developed institutional processes for continuing afterward. "You know what this is," Ned said. "I know what it resembles," Varys said carefully, in the manner of a man who has learned to be precise about the difference. "I have served in this city for 15 years. I have had little birds everywhere, in every district, in every guild hall, in every sept and inn and brothel. In that time I have heard stories from merchants who trade the shivering sea routes, from free folk who occasionally reach the wall's southern side and are brought before the Night's Watch, from maesters at the Citadel who study things the Citadel does not officially believe in." He looked at Ned steadily. "I know what lives beyond the wall. I know it is not merely wildlings and cold weather. And I know that what is happening in Flea Bottom's Tannery District is not a coincidence that follows the arrival of," he looked at the figure, "whatever the old gods have placed in our city. It followed through," Ned said. "The dimensional resonance when it arrived, when the weirwood pulled it here. It opened something, or widened something, something that was already there." "Yes." Varys was quiet for a moment. "I have been considering how to bring this to the small council. The difficulty is that Lord Tywin will immediately move to frame any northern threat as a justification for increased Lannister military presence along the neck. Lord Robert, the slight, almost imperceptible pause before Lord that told Ned Varys was still adjusting to the new title. His Grace will not want to hear about supernatural threats 2 weeks into his reign. He has a legitimacy to establish, a city to rebuild, loyalist lords to negotiate with. A report of walking dead and flee. Bottom will be received as either hysteria or political maneuvering. So you came to me. I came to you. Varys agreed. Because you already know. And because, he looked at the figure again. Because that knows, and has known since before the Trident. And I believe it has been waiting for the humans around it to arrive at the correct response. A pause. What is the correct response, Lord Stark? Ned called the meeting himself. Not a small council session, a private meeting. In the Tower of the Hand's lower chamber. With the people who needed to be there rather than the people who were entitled to be. Jon Arryn came. Because Jon Arryn was the most dependable mind. Ned knew, and because keeping things from him was both practically difficult and personally wrong. Howland Reed came. Because he had been in King's Landing since the sack at Ned's quiet request. Moving through the city with the Crannogman's gift for invisibility. And had been making his own observations. Varys came. Because Varys already knew, and because Ned had learned in the weeks since the Trident that knowing what Varys knew was substantially preferable to not knowing. Baelish was not invited. Ned had thought about it and decided the answer was not yet. Not because he distrusted Baelish's information, which had been accurate, but because the distinction between Baelish sharing useful intelligence and Baelish acquiring leverage over the people who acted on that intelligence was a distinction Ned was not yet confident he could maintain in a room where everyone else was focused on a different problem. The figure stood at the chamber's wall and said nothing, and was the most important person in the room. Ned laid out what he knew. Varys laid out what he knew. Howland Reed laid out what the Weirwoods had been saying, which was fragmentary and imagistic in the way of old god communication. Not a coherent briefing, but a series of impressions that assembled into something coherent if you knew how to read them. Jon Arryn listened to all of it with the expression he wore when fostered boys were confessing things he had already suspected and had been hoping would resolve themselves before requiring adult intervention. When they finished, Jon Arryn was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, with the measured precision that was his particular gift, the immediate problem is containment. Whatever is animating these bodies in the Flea Bottom district needs to be stopped before it becomes a panic. A city that survived a sack does not need to learn that the dead are walking in the tannery district. He looked at the figure. Can it address this directly? The figure looked at Ned. Ned looked back. He had been thinking about this, about what it meant to deploy the figure in the city against the city's own dead, in a civilian district where the sack's trauma was still raw, about what the Gold Cloaks would report, about what Robert would eventually hear and how it would be explained, about the political cost of the explanation against the cost of doing nothing. It can, Ned said, but not quietly. There's no quiet version of what it does. Then we make it official, Jon Arryn said. Give it a formal role, not the crown's sworn sword, which it apparently won't accept, but something that explains its presence and its actions within a framework the realm can understand. He thought for a moment. Robert wants to honor it publicly for the Trident. He's been asking about a ceremony. We give him his ceremony. We give it a title that is honorable and vague enough to encompass what it actually does. And when the Gold Cloaks report, armored figures destroying walking dead in the Tannery District, there is an official context for those reports. And when Robert asks what it was doing in the Tannery District, Ned said, we tell him exactly what it was doing. Jon Arryn said simply, we tell Robert Baratheon that there are things beyond the wall that require addressing, that the old gods sent this warrior to address them, and that some of those things have apparently decided to visit King's Landing first. He met Ned's eyes. Robert is not an unintelligent man. He is an impatient man, which is different. Given sufficient reason to take a threat seriously, he can be made to take it seriously. Howland Reed said, from the corner where he had been, sitting in his particular quality of watchful silence. The Weirwoods are saying something else. Everyone looked at him. They've been saying it for 3 days, and I've been trying to understand it clearly enough to report it. Howland's voice was careful and slow, in the way of someone translating from a language that didn't map cleanly onto the one he was speaking. The things in the Tannery District, the whites, they're not scouts. They're not a vanguard. He paused. They're a message. Something beyond the wall knows that it is here. He looked at the figure, and it wants it to know that it knows. The chamber went very quiet. Ned looked at the figure. The figure was looking north, through the tower's stone wall, through the city's streets, and the northern wall and the King's Road, and the neck in the wall itself, north, with the focused, terrible patience of something that had been waiting for this confirmation. Its hands, hanging at its sides, had closed into fists. Slowly, deliberately, the way a warrior's hands close before an engagement they have been anticipating for a very long time. It's not a message, Ned said quietly. Understanding arriving with the cold clarity of things that have been true for a while, becoming visible. It's a challenge. He looked at the faces around the table, Jon Arryn's careful gravity, Varys's massed calculation, Howland Reed's quiet dread, and then at the figure, whose entire bearing in this moment communicated something that needed no translation, no minimal gesture, no borrowed vocabulary, something old and vast and patient beyond any Westerosi conception of patience. Had looked south from whatever it was, had seen what the old gods had placed in this city, and had decided that the time for waiting was ending. And the thing in the corner of the hand's chamber had been waiting for exactly that decision for longer than Westeros had existed. We go north, Ned said. After the ceremony, after Robert is briefed, he looked around the table, and we go prepared. They rode north in the last week of the moon's turn, when King's Landing had begun to feel like a city trying to forget what it had recently been, and the Red Keep had settled into the uneasy rhythms of a new reign finding its shape. Robert's ceremony had happened as Jon Arryn planned it, a formal assembly in the throne room, lords of the realm present, the rebellion's principal figures gathered in the specific tableau of a victorious king distributing honors to those who had earned them. Robert had been genuinely good at it, which he usually was when the occasion called. For the charisma that was his most natural instrument, he had honored Ned with the handship in terms that were warm and public, and that Ned had accepted with the quiet, private resignation of a man who understood duty and had stopped expecting it to feel like choice. He had honored the figure with a title that Jon Arryn had constructed with characteristic precision, sworn sword of the old gods, protector of the realm's ancient compact. It meant nothing in any established Westerosi legal or hierarchical framework, which was precisely its value. It explained the figure's presence, acknowledged its service, and established a context for its ongoing actions without requiring fealty. It would not swear or chains of command. It would not observe. Robert had delivered the title with the full weight of his considerable public presence, looking up at the blank visor with an expression that was half ceremony and half the genuine, barely contained awe of a man who had watched the thing move through the Trident's center and had not yet stopped thinking about it. The figure had stood through the ceremony with its characteristic stillness. It had not knelt. Robert had not asked it to. Afterward, in private, Robert had gripped Ned's arm and said, with the directness he reserved for moments when the performance was set aside, "You're going north." "Yes." "The wall." "Yes." Robert had looked at him for a long moment, the long, measuring look that Robert Baratheon used when he was deciding whether to be a king or a friend, and which usually resolved toward friend because friendship was the thing Robert was best at and kingship was the thing he was still learning. "Take what you need from the royal stores," he said. "Men, supplies, whatever Maester Whaley's has been writing to you about. Don't tell me everything. I have 17 other things trying to kill my reign this week, and I can only carry so many. But tell me enough that I know when to send reinforcements." "I'll send ravens," Ned said. "Send them to Jon Arryn. He'll know what they mean, and he won't panic." Robert paused, and Ned, the friend's voice, fully, not the king's. "Come back." Ned had said he would. He intended to keep that promise, which in Westeros was the most you could do with intentions. The column that rode north was small by design, 40 of Ned's household guard, Howland Reed, and 8 Crannogmen, and the figure that walked among them like a fact of nature, neither requiring nor requesting anything, consuming the miles with the tireless ground-eating stride that Ned had stopped being surprised by. They picked up Benjen Stark at the crossroads below the neck. Ned's younger brother was 22, dark-haired and gray-eyed in the Stark way, with the particular quality of stillness that was the family inheritance, and that manifested differently in each of them. In Ned as gravity, in Benjen as watchfulness, the attentive, patient quality of a man who listened more than he spoke and remembered everything he heard. He had been ranging along the King's Road's northern reaches during the rebellion's latter phases, gathering intelligence about wildling movements and Night's Watch, conditions that Ned had requested. Through careful ravens, he looked at the figure when the columns merged with the same long, assessing attention he gave everything he encountered for the first time. Then he looked at Ned with an expression that contained several questions he was choosing to address in sequence. The old gods, Ned said preemptively. I'd gathered, Benjen said. The Night's Watch has had reports. Commander Corgyle sent ravens south that I intercepted rather than forwarding. Because the contents were, he paused, selecting the word with care, disquieting, and I wanted to understand them before they reached King's Landing and were explained away by people who needed to explain things away. How disquieting. Benjen looked north, with the Stark family's habitual northern look, that orientation toward the cold, that the family had developed over generations of watching the horizon, where things came from. 3 ranging parties have not returned in the past 4 months. That's not unprecedented. The ranging beyond the wall is dangerous and losses happen. But the recovery teams that went after the first 2 parties found, he stopped. They found the men, or what had been the men, in conditions that matched your Kingswood reports from the rebellion march, which I read in your letters and which I have been thinking about ever since. Whites, Ned said. The Night's Watch doesn't use that word officially. They use irregularities and anomalous fatalities and language that very carefully avoids saying what the language is describing. Vengeance. Voice carried a dry, precise contempt for the administrative cowardice of euphemism. But yes, whites. The column moved north through the gray afternoon, the next distinctive wetland smell beginning to reach them on the wind. And Ned told Benjen everything. The Godswood, the Trident, the wildfire, the Tannery District, Varys's files, Howland Reed's Weirwood translations. Benjen listened without interrupting, which was his habit. And when Ned finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he looked at the figure moving ahead of them in the column. It knows what's up there, he said. Not a question. Yes. And it's been waiting to go. Since the first night in Winterfell's Godswood, Ned said. Everything since then. The rebellion, the Trident, the sack, the Tannery District. I think it cooperated because it understood that the human political situation needed resolving before the northern situation could be addressed. It calculated that a destabilized realm was a worse foundation for what's coming than a stable one. He paused. It thinks strategically, not just tactically. Benjen absorbed this with the thoughtful expression of a man revising his model of the universe. I've been considering joining the Night's Watch, he said, after a moment. Ned looked at him. The Rangers who aren't coming back, Benjen said simply. Someone should be paying attention up there who knows what to look for. The Watches. He searched for the diplomatic version and settled for the honest one. The Watch is understaffed, underfunded, and led by a man who is competent and overwhelmed, and being given resources appropriate to a threat the realm has decided doesn't exist. He looked north again. Someone should be there who knows. Ned said nothing for a moment. Then, wait until after the wall. They reached Castle Black in 12 days. Lord Commander Corgyle received them in the castle's main hall with the carefully managed expression of a man who had been desperately hoping for exactly this visit and was trying not to let that desperation show because desperate Lord Commanders did not project the authority there. Undermanned, underfunded, underthanked, order required. He was 60, gray-bearded, with the permanent squint of a man who spent too much time looking at the horizon for things he didn't want to see. And he looked at the armored figure with an expression that moved through surprise, recognition, and profound relief in the span of approximately 2 seconds. You know what it is, Ned said. I know what it reminds me of, Corgyle said carefully. The old tongue texts, the histories that predate the Undul invasion. He looked at the figure again. We have a term, Lord Stark. In the oldest Night's Watch records, texts most of my brothers. Consider mythology. The eternal sentinel, a figure described in accounts of the first long night, moving ahead of the dawn's forces, clearing paths through the white armies with, he stopped. With its hands, Primarily, the Great Hall was very quiet. The first long night, Ned said. 8,000 years ago. Corgyle's voice was that of a man who had been sitting on information, too large and too frightening for his institutional context. The histories are fragmentary. Most maesters dismiss them as allegorical. But the core account, an armored figure, silent, pulled through a weirwood by powers that predate the wall itself, fighting alongside the first men against the White Walkers and their dead. He looked at the figure one more time. The histories say it left when the White Walkers were driven back, went back through the weirwood, a pause that carried the full weight of the question it contained. The histories also say the White Walkers left something behind when they retreated, something dormant, something waiting. Waiting for what? Ned said, though he already knew. For the magic to return, Corgyle said quietly. The White Walkers' power diminished when dragons left the world. But dragons are, he paused. Dragons aren't gone. They're coming back. Everyone knows Daenerys Targaryen's eggs. The rumors from Essos about. Focus, Ned said. The wall. The current ranging losses. What are we dealing with? Corgyle took them to the map room. The map was old and hand-drawn and covered. In the Night's Watch's careful notations accumulated. Over decades of ranging reports. A dense palimpsest of information about the territory. Beyond the wall that told a story. In its own accumulation. Corgyle pointed to the notations from the past 8 months, which were clustered in a pattern that had meaning. Once you knew what you were looking for, they're not ranging randomly, Benjen said, tracing the pattern with one finger. This is systematic. Survey movements. They're mapping the southern edge of their territory. Preparing, Howland Reed said from the room's edge. For what? One of Ned's household guard asked, and received the particular silence of a room full of people who knew the answer and were reluctant to say it plainly, because saying things plainly made them more real. Ned said it plainly. For a march south. He looked at the figure. The figure was looking at the map, at the clustering of notations, at the pattern Benjen had identified. Its gauntlet hand moved to the map's northern edge and rested there for a moment, not pointing exactly, but indicating, with the minimal precision that was its entire communication vocabulary, a specific area in the furthest north where the ranging notations stopped entirely, where the Night's Watch's knowledge ended, where something was. We go beyond the wall, Ned said. Corgyle looked at him with the expression of a man who has been simultaneously dreading and needing to hear exactly those words. I'll give you rangers, he said. My best. Ser Dennis Mallister's men are. No, Ned said. Your men stay south of the wall. He looked at the figure. At Howland Reed. At Benjen. We go light. We go fast. We find what's there and we assess it and we come back. He met the figure's visor. And whatever we find up there, we let it do what it was pulled here to do. The figure held his gaze for a moment. Then it turned to the wall itself, visible through the map room's narrow window. Massive and ancient and pale blue-white in the late afternoon light. 700 feet of ice and ancient magic and the accumulated determination of thousands of years of men standing between the realm and what lay beyond it. It walked to the window. It looked up at the wall. And in the quality of its stillness in that moment, in the set of those armored shoulders, in the forward orientation of that blank visor, in the gathered, patient, terrible readiness of a thing that had been fighting one war across 1,000 worlds and had finally, after all the politics and the rebellions and the burning cities and the sacked capitals, found the front it had been waiting for. Ned Stark understood with complete clarity why the old gods had pulled it through the weirwood. Not for Robert's rebellion, not for the wildfire, not for the Trident's outcome or King's Landing's salvation or any of the human politics that had consumed the past months. For this, for what lay in the darkness beyond that wall, for the thing that had been waiting, patient as winter and cold as the space between stars, since the last time this armored figure had stood in a weirwood's light, and the old gods had needed something capable of meeting death itself on its own terms. Ned looked at the wall. Benjen looked at the wall. Howland Reed looked at the figure looking at the wall. And beyond it, in the vast frozen darkness of the true north, something that had been dormant for 8,000 years felt the presence it had been waiting for and began with the terrible patience of something that did not experience timed the way the living did, to move. They went over the wall at dawn. Corgyle had offered the gate. Passage, the tunnel through the walls. Base that the Night's Watch used for its rangings. The ancient mechanism of chains and counterweights that opened the world's largest door onto the world's most dangerous territory. Ned had accepted for the men. The figure had looked at the tunnel's entrance. With the brief assessment it gave, logistical details, and then simply climbed the wall's southern face. 700 feet of ancient ice in the gray pre-dawn, moving with the fluid, implacable ease of something that classified vertical surfaces as terrain rather than obstacles. The rangers on the wall's top had watched it come over the edge and had collectively decided, with the philosophical pragmatism of men who had been at Castle Black long enough to recalibrate their definitions of impossible, that filing a report about this could wait until after whatever was about to happen had finished happening. The territory beyond the wall was another world. Not metaphorically, literally, in the way that mattered, in the way that the body registered before the mind processed it. The cold was different beyond the wall. Not merely colder, though it was substantially colder even in what should have been late summer's final warmth, but qualitatively different. A cold with intention in it. A cold that felt less like weather and more like presence. Like the air itself had chosen a side in something and had been choosing it for a very long time. The trees were wrong. Not dramatically wrong, not twisted nightmare. Shapes from a fever story, but subtly, persistently wrong in the way that things in dreams are wrong. Familiar structures with an underlying geometry that doesn't quite resolve correctly when you look directly at it. The silence was the wrongest thing. The north beyond the wall should have had ambient sound, wind, animals, the creak of frozen wood. It had none of these. It had the silence of a held breath. Ned rode with Ben-Jin at his left and Howland Reed at his right, and the figure ahead. Because it had taken the vanguard without discussion, moving through the snow-covered terrain at the pace it set, when it was tracking rather than traveling. Systematic, thorough, reading a landscape the way experienced rangers read landscapes. Except that what it was reading for was not the ordinary ranger's catalog of threat and shelter and resource. It was reading for the specific signatures of what it hunted. They found the first evidence 4 hours north of the wall. A ranging camp, or what had been a ranging camp, 3 weeks ago by the condition of the supplies and the fire pit's ash. 7 Night's Watch brothers, identifiable by their black cloaks which the cold had preserved with the indifferent thoroughness. It preserved everything, laid out with a deliberateness that was the detail. Ned's mind snagged on immediately, because bodies left by ordinary violence were not laid out. Bodies left by cold and exposure were not laid out. These men had been arranged, on their backs, arms at their sides, in a row, with the geometric precision of something that was making a point rather than simply leaving the dead where they fell. 6 of them were still. The 7th was not. It was Ben-Jin who noticed, Ben-Jin, who had been reading ranging reports for months and whose eyes had been calibrated for the specific wrongness of what the reports described. The one on the end, he said, very quietly, from horseback, his hand already moving to his sword. The one on the end was breathing. Not the breathing of a living man, not the chest rise and visible exhalation of warmth meeting cold air. The breathing of something that was performing the motion of breathing because motion was a thing it could do, and it was doing the things it could do. Its eyes opened. Blue. The specific blue that had no equivalent in anything living. Not the blue of sky or water or ice, but a blue that existed only in this context. The blue of death animated by something that was not life. The color that the Night's Watch's oldest records described, and that the realm's lords in their comfortable southern castles categorized as folklore. The figure was already moving. It crossed the distance between itself and the white in 2 strides, and the white came upright with the lurching, wrongly jointed speed of dead muscle, responding to something other than its own nervous system. And what followed was brief and absolute. The figure took the white by the throat, one gauntlet hand, the grip that Ned had watched disarm knights and redirect warhorses. And the white's hands came up with the clawing, purposeless aggression of a thing that had lost everything except the drive to destroy, and the figure simply held it at arm's length and squeezed with the controlled, calibrated force of something that knew exactly how much pressure the situation required. The white collapsed, not burning. They had no fire prepared. And the figure had learned from the tannery district incidents that fire was the reliable method. It held the collapsed white down with one knee on its chest, preventing the animation from reasserting, and looked back at Ned with the communicative tilt of its visor that meant this is a demonstration. Pay attention. Howland Reed was already off his horse, moving toward the fire pit, working with the focused efficiency of a man who had read enough Old God texts to know what came next. He had the fire going in less than a minute, dry tinder from his pack, flint and steel, the small practical preparations of someone who had anticipated this need. The figure dragged the white to the fire by its collar. And what happened in the next 30 seconds was not something Ned would describe in his Raven to Robert Baratheon with any specificity, because some operational details served no purpose beyond making the recipient lose sleep. The white stopped moving. They burned the other 6 men where they lay, as a precaution, and stood in the silence of the frozen north with the fire's warmth, doing very little against the intentional cold. And Ned said a quiet stark prayer for the dead in the old way, facing north, because that was where the old gods looked for men. These men deserved acknowledgement from whatever power was available to acknowledge them. The figure stood at the camp's perimeter during the prayer, facing north, very still. They found the White Walkers 3 hours later. Not all of them, Ned understood instinctively. From everything Corgyle's records and Howland's translations had assembled, that what they were looking at was a forward element, a scouting presence, the leading edge of something much larger, that lay further north in the darkness beyond the geography of Night's Watch ranging. 4 of them, standing in the treeline at the edge of a frozen lake. Motionless in the way that things motionless by choice were motionless, not frozen, not absent, but present and still and watching with the alien, crystalline intelligence of creatures that experience time differently than anything that had been born rather than made. They were beautiful in the way that glaciers were beautiful, ancient, vast, indifferent to the category of beauty, simply being what they were with the absolute completeness of things that had never needed to be anything else. They wore armor of ice that was also somehow not ice. The same wrong geometry quality that the territory itself had. Familiar structure with underlying logic that didn't resolve correctly. Their weapons were long and pale, and the air around them was colder than the air around anything else. Cold in the intentional way. The presence cold that Ned had been feeling since they crossed the wall. They looked at the column. They looked at the figure. Something passed between them and the figure that Ned could not see or hear, but that he felt in the way he felt weather changing. A shift in the atmospheric pressure of the moment, a recognition, a communication happening in a register that human senses were not equipped to fully receive. The White Walkers' crystalline faces did not move. The figure's visor did not move. But the quality of the stillness between them changed, the way the quality of silence changes when 2 things that know each other have established each other's presence. Then the lead White Walker raised one pale hand, and from the lake behind them, from beneath the ice that Ned had not realized was covering shallow water rather than solid ground, the dead began to rise. Not 7, not a dozen, scores of them, the accumulated dead of ranging parties and wildling villages, and things that had died in this territory over years and decades, preserved by the cold and waiting in the specific patience of things that did not experience waiting as anything other than a state to eventually end. They came through the ice with the lurching, relentless motion of dead things directed by something that could direct them, and they came in the direction of the living. And there were enough of them that Ned's household guard, good men, experienced men, looked at the numbers and went very quiet, in the way that soldiers went quiet when mathematics delivered a verdict they did not want to accept. The figure turned to Ned. One gauntlet hand came up, the minimal gesture, the vocabulary they had developed over months of learning each other, and pointed at the tree line to the east, then at Howland Reed, then at Ben Jen. Then, with a deliberateness that made the instruction unmistakable, swept the hand southward. Get them clear. All of them. South. Ned looked at the rising dead, at the 4 White Walkers watching from the treeline with their crystalline patience, at the figure, which had turned back to face the lake and the approaching army and had settled into the posture it adopted before engagements, not tense, not afraid, simply gathered. The absolute readiness of something that had been doing this for so long that it had stopped being preparation and had become simply its natural state. "My lord," Roderick said quietly from horseback. "I heard it," Ned said. "We can't leave it." "It's not asking us to help it," Ned said. He looked at Benjen, at Howland, at his household guard, whose faces were doing the complicated work of men processing the gap between what their courage wanted and what their intelligence was telling them. "It's asking us to survive, because we're needed for what comes after." He looked at the figure one more time, at the armored shape, standing between his people and on army of the dead, at the old gods. Instrument finally arrived at the purpose it had been placed here for, at the thing that had crossed worlds and won a rebellion and navigated a burning city and waited with terrible patience for this exact moment. "Move. All of you. East Treeline." Now, they moved. Ned moved last, because he was a Stark, and Starks did not leave anything behind without witnessing it. He turned his horse at the Treeline's edge and looked back across the frozen lake as his column disappeared into the trees behind him. The figure had not moved. The whites were 40 yards from it. 30. The White Walkers watched from there. Treeline with the absolute stillness of things that had been waiting 8,000 years for this rematch and were in no hurry now that it had arrived. The figure's hands came up, not for the long sword. Ned understood in this moment that the long sword had always been a concession to the context it had been navigating, a tool adopted for the humans around it, a translation of its methods into a language Westeros could recognize. What it was now, on this frozen lake, with no politics to navigate and no hierarchies to respect, and no human sensibilities to account for, was what it had always actually been. The first white reached it. What happened next was not something Ned Stark had language for. He would try, later, in private, in the God's Wood at Winterfell with only the heart tree to hear him. And he would find that the words available to him were all wrong, too small, too bounded by the ordinary scale of human violence, too dependent on frameworks of speed and force that the moment had exceeded so thoroughly that using them felt like describing the ocean with the vocabulary of puddles. He watched for as long as he could see clearly. Then the trees closed around him, and the sounds that followed him south were unlike anything in any Westerosi catalog of battle. And he rode hard with his brother at his side and Howland, Reed's quiet presence behind him, and the cold wind from the north carrying something that might have been the sound of the White Walker's composure finally, for the first time in 8,000 years, encountering something that warranted its disruption. They reached the wall by nightfall. Corgyle met them at the gate with the expression of a man who had been watching the northern horizon for hours and was reading the quality of what came back through the gate with professional thoroughness. He looked at the column, counted, looked north, counted again, said nothing for a long moment. "It's still up there," Ned said. "Yes," Corgyle said. "We could see." He stopped. "From the wall's top. We could see." He stopped again. Started over. "The Ravens are going to have difficulty with this. Lord Stark, I'm not sure the language exists." "Use the old language," Howland Reed said quietly. "The Night's Watch has the old records. Use the words the first men used." Corgyle looked at him. "The first men called it." "I know what they called it," Ned said. He looked north, over the wall, into the darkness where something ancient and purposed was doing what it had been doing since before Westeros had a name. He thought about the God's Wood at Winterfell, and the split weirwood, and the blood-red pool, and a 19-year-old lord of the north looking across the heart trees lighted something the old gods had decided the world needed. He thought about what Maester Whaleys had called it, the living flame and the devouring dark, a war older than Westeros, fought across more worlds than the children of the forest could count. "Send the ravens in the morning," he said. "Tonight we hold the wall." He looked at the darkness beyond it, somewhere out there in the frozen north, between the army of the dead and the ancient cold intelligence that directed it. Something was doing what it had always done, in every world it had been placed in, by powers that saw further than any king or maester or lord had ever managed to see. Ned Stark pulled his cloak tighter against the wall's cold. Winter was here, but so was something older than winter. And for the first time since the gods would split open and his life became something the Histories would struggle to accurately record. He thought they might. Not easily. Not without cost. Not without the kind of sacrifice that the old gods had always extracted for the gifts they gave, but might, genuinely, be ready for it. The histories of Robert's rebellion, as written by the Citadel's maesters in the years that followed, contained a peculiar gap. They recorded the Trident accurately enough, Robert's hammer, Rhaegar's rubies, the Crown Prince's fall in the Red Water. They recorded the sack's broad strokes, Jaime Lannister's defining act, the wildfire that did not burn. They recorded the new king's reign beginning with the practical chaos of a continent reorganizing itself around a new center of power. What they could not record accurately was the northern column's contribution to the Trident's decisive moment, because the eyewitness accounts contradicted each other in their specifics and agreed only in their broad outline, and maesters were uncomfortable writing broad outlines into official histories. What they recorded even less accurately was the expedition to the Wall. They knew it had happened. New Lord Stark had ridden north with a small column and returned without a member of that column that had apparently remained beyond the wall. But the details of what had been found and what had been done with it fell into the category of knights. Watch records that the Citadel, officially considered mythological. The small folk were less concerned with official categories. In the villages along the King's Road north of the Neck, in the taverns of Wintertown, in the Cranagmen's stories that passed through the Necks, waterways in the particular oral tradition of a people who had never needed the Citadel's approval to know what they knew. A different account circulated, an armored figure, silent as the gods that sent it, that had come through a weirwood's eye and changed the course of a war and walked north into the dark when the real war called. A name that was not a name, that was a description, in the oldest language, of what it did. It was not Azor Ahai. That prophecy belonged to fire. This was something else. Something the old stories had a different word for. Something that had been here before. And in the furthest north, where the Night's Watch Rangers did not go, and the White Walkers had retreated, to regroup in the darkness. The war continued, as it always had, as it always would, in a cold so deep it had forgotten what warmth felt like. But warmth, like legends, endured. All men must die, but legends endure. More stories await.